The Montana wind had teeth, and tonight it chewed on the ghost of the man I'd just put in the ground. Every gust that howled through the cracks of this small cabin clawed at the hollow in my chest. A cold space carved out from the moment my gun was hot, and his blood was warm on my hands. I had run with a ragged wound in my shoulder and a hope as thin as gun smoke, until my horse gave out and I stumbled toward the only light for miles, a single, lonely lamp defying the endless dark. A gunshot tore through the quiet Montana night, followed by a heavy slam against Alara Vance's front door. It wasn't a knock. The door burst open and I collapsed inside, my Colt revolver tumbling from a weak hand as a dark stain of my own blood began to spread across her clean wooden floor. Through the haze of pain, I saw her standing there, no scream, no panicked movement. She just looked down at the growing pool of blood and said in a voice as cold as ice, "You're getting my floor dirty." I looked up at her, my vision blurring with pain, but I saw a flicker of astonishment in her eyes at my calmness. Alara Vance was not the kind of woman you'd expect to find at the edge of nowhere. There was a hardness in her, forged by loss and solitude. I could see it in the way she stood, steady as a rock that the storm had tried and failed to wear away. Her eyes, sharp and practical, darted to my wound. She saw it wasn't a simple bullet hole. A jagged piece of metal was still lodged in my shoulder, dangerously close to an artery. Outside, I heard the hoofbeats of 2 riders passing in the night, their sounds fading into the distance. The hunt had lost my trail for now. Without a word, she dragged me inside and bolted the door. I had expected fear, maybe pity, but instead I saw in her eyes a deep recognition of the desperation in mine, a feeling she was all too familiar with. She used a bottle of her late husband's old whiskey and a razor-sharp skinning knife to dig the shrapnel out herself. The pain was white-hot, and I bit down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, the salt of my own sweat and blood mixing in my mouth. The first few days passed in a feverish delirium. I mumbled names and places I'd tried to bury, a train robbery, a betrayal, and one name that repeated like a curse, Blackwood. When I finally came to my senses, I found her sitting by the bed, her eyes searching mine. "Blackwood," she said. It wasn't a question, but a quiet accusation. "You know Corbin Blackwood?" That name, from her lips in this remote place, was a shock colder than a November well. Blackwood was the sheriff in the next county over, the man who had orchestrated the train robbery, the man who had framed me. He was the reason I was bleeding out in a stranger's bed. I could only nod, my throat too dry to speak. A worried line creased her brow, and I realized my ghost had just walked through her door and made himself at home. Danger didn't wait long. 3 days later, a trio of bounty hunters rode up to the ranch, led by a cruel, scar-faced man named Jed. They didn't just ask questions. They claimed the right to search the property, citing they were assisting Sheriff Blackwood. From a crack in the floorboards of the barn where she'd hidden me, I saw everything. I saw the contempt in Jed's eyes as he looked at Alara, saw the way he tried to shoulder her aside to get inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, my hand tightening on my cleaned and reloaded Colt. But then I heard the dry, double click of a shotgun's hammers being cocked. "Take one more step," Alara said, her voice as cold and steady as steel, "and I'll see what your guts look like." The silence stretched on. Jed looked at her, then at the shotgun, and a nasty sneer spread across his lips. "You've got nerve, widow." They left reluctantly, but Jed's glare promised this wasn't over. That night, she brought me food. The silence between us was now heavy with unspoken things. "You shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice hoarse. "There's a $1,000 price on my head." "I know," she replied, not looking at me. "Then why?" Alara stopped at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the lantern light. She turned, and in her eyes I saw a profound pain, a weariness I recognized instantly. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted by ghosts, Kane, and I'm tired of running." She left, leaving me with those words and an undeniable truth. Our fates, for whatever reason, were now intertwined. And I had a feeling our ghosts were just getting started. Her words hung in the cold barn air, sharp and heavy as an unfired bullet. "And I'm tired of running." It wasn't a declaration of defiance, but a weary confession, the whisper of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. In that moment, she stopped being my savior. She became my accomplice, bound to me by a shared enemy and a profound exhaustion with the world. We were no longer an outlaw and a widow. We were 2 survivors, standing on the same ledge. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The silence between us was no longer cautious but companionable. I began helping around the ranch, small chores my shoulder could handle. And in that shared work, a rhythm formed. I would catch her watching me. Her gaze no longer searching for threat but for something else. Maybe a sign that her trust wasn't misplaced. One evening, as she was changing the dressing on my healing wound, her fingers brushed against an old white scar on my chest. She didn't flinch. "From a friend," I said, my voice level. But she held my gaze. "Taught me the most valuable lesson I ever learned. Never turn your back on anyone. My husband, Elias, he trusted people," she whispered, her voice distant. "He trusted Blackwood. And that was when Sheriff Corbin Blackwood decided to pay a visit. He arrived on a big black gelding, his silver-trimmed saddle glinting in the harsh Montana sun. He had the smile of a preacher and the eyes of a snake. Alara met him on the porch, her shotgun leaning against the doorframe well within reach. I was under the floorboards of the main cabin, cramped and suffocating in the dark, the smell of damp earth and spiders filling my lungs. I could hear everything through the cracks, the creak of his boots on her floor, the honeyed poison of his voice as he asked after her well-being. "Just want to make sure you're safe out here, Alara," he said, "with all this riffraff about." "I can take care of myself, Corbin," she replied, her voice all ice. He laughed, a sound that didn't hold any humor. "I don't doubt it." He paced, and for a moment his boots stopped directly above my head. Elias always did say this land had secrets. He never did appreciate what he had out here. He paused and his voice lowered, becoming venomously intimate. Or who he had. Rage rose in my throat, hot and sour. This wasn't business. This was obsession. I gripped my Colt, my knuckles white, fighting the urge to burst up through the floorboards and end it right there. But I stayed still, a prisoner of my own concealment, forced to listen as this serpent coiled himself through her home. After he'd gone, I crawled out, covered in dust and helpless fury. Alara stood at the window watching him until he was a black speck on the horizon. She said nothing, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. That night, the space between our makeshift beds seemed both wider and smaller than ever before. Dawn came too quickly. I was outside the barn tending to Alara's lone horse when a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I looked up and saw him. Jed. The scar-faced bounty hunter was back, alone, his pistol already in his hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "I knew it," he snarled. "I knew you were here." There was no time for thought, only instinct. It was a dance of death, fast and brutal. He was quick on the draw, but I was quicker. I didn't stand still. I lunged to the side, my Colt an extension of my arm. Jed's first shot splintered the post where I'd just been standing. The retort from my own gun answered, dry and final. He staggered, surprise plain on his face. He tried to fire again, but I was already moving, using an old water trough for cover as I fired a second. True shot. Jed collapsed in the dust. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the wind and my own ragged breaths. Gun smoke coiled around me, its taste miserably familiar. The cabin door flew open and Alara ran out, her face a pale mask of horror as she took in the body, and me, standing with my smoking gun. Everything seemed to freeze. I expected tears, panic, maybe an accusation. I got none of it. She looked from the body to me, her eyes terrifyingly dark and empty. The softness I'd started to see in her was gone, replaced by something as hard and cold as flint. She took a single, steadying breath. "Get inside the barn," she said, her voice chillingly level. "Get the shovel. We have work to do before the sun gets any higher."